What would you eat instead of meat if you became a vegetarian? Stay tuned to see one way to make all the meat you eat out of wheat instead of beef. Hello, I'm Marcella Lynch. Welcome to Food for Thought, the cooking show featuring God's eating plan as unfolded through Scripture and through God's other book, the Book of Nature. Today I'd like to tell you why I am a vegetarian and demonstrate an interesting recipe for making meat out of wheat, which costs pennies a serving and can resemble cutlets, steaks, roasts, and hamburger. It's an old recipe. My mother made it when I was a child. Vegetarian people around the world make it today, and commercial food companies produce canned and frozen meat look-alike products from it. Does the Bible have anything to say about meat eating? Yes, it says a lot. It would be much too short to cover the subject. You may want to write in for the booklet advertised at the end of the show. Looking at the dietary principles in the Bible, we find that in the very beginning, both humans and animals were created vegetarians. Later, of course, God did allow the eating of meat. The Bible itself doesn't make it clear as to why he did this. One possible answer could be that since Noah's flood destroyed the vegetation, some of the animals in the ark could be slaughtered and their meat preserved and eaten until the first harvest. Another interesting possibility has to do with the lifespan of people who lived in those days. You know, God created Adam and Eve with bodies that were designed to exist forever, but that was before they sinned. And tragically, the longer a sinner lives, the more agony he causes himself and others. People and generations suffer. In Genesis 6:5, it indicates that the pre-flood people were terribly depraved. Can you imagine the chaos of an 800-year-old Hitler and what that could cause in one lifetime? And that may be one reason why God introduced a meat diet. At about the time when God began to allow people to eat meat, the lifespans began to rocket downward until they ended up closer to what lifespans are today. But even though God did allow meat to be eaten, he still regarded the human body as very precious. And that's why in Leviticus 11, he listed the do-eats and the don't-eats of the animal, bird, and seafood kingdoms and animals. Another evidence of God's brilliance is shown. By and large, the creatures God labeled unclean are the scavengers of the earth. These are examples such as pork and shellfish, buzzards, crows, which would carry more disease and whose bodies are designed to retain the poisons and filth of their diet. Fat and blood was not to be eaten. Meat eating is a factor in human diseases such as heart disease and cancer, and the fat contains cholesterol, and the blood carries disease. I like the following poem written some years ago by G.C. Haskin. It's about the horse and animals. The horse is big and fat and round, but eats the grains that do abound. The ox is wide and thick and stout, and lives on grasses grown about. The elephant, so great and strong, with hay and grain his days prolong. The dinosaur his years amaze, yet vegetarian stretched his days. A baboon's strength is not from meats, for fruits and vegetables he eats. If fruits and grains and grass and hay give animals such strength each day, then give me too that simple fare that Mother Nature doth prepare. I was born into a vegetarian family, and being a third-generation vegetarian, I've never eaten meat, poultry, or fish. Eating plant foods is just a way of life for me, and I've never acquired even a liking for the smell of meat cooking because it's just never been a part of my upbringing. It's just as natural for me to eat vegetarian meals as it is for you to include meat. So why be a vegetarian? There are a number of good reasons. First of all, it's healthier. That's been proven. Research shows that vegetarians live longer and have less disease. Plant foods contain absolutely no cholesterol. A plant-based diet is a low-fat diet with less fat, unless you, of course, load up on refined manufactured foods. Meat lacks fiber. A meat diet is a high-protein diet and a fat diet when our diet should be based on carbohydrates. Meat can bring disease from the animals to you. It is a cancer potential. Another reason that people choose to be vegetarian is that a vegetarian diet actually costs less. We protect also the earth's resources by raising plant food crops rather than animals for food. For example, an acre of land produces 17 pounds of protein compared to about 2 for milk and less than 1 for beef. And another reason is that animals do not have to be mass-produced in factory farms, living an unnatural life with possible inhumane treatment when we're vegetarians. Another reason for being vegetarian has to do with our mind and our spiritual senses. It's actually been shown that they are more clear and alert with the plant-based diet. The Bible story of Daniel and his 3 friends showed better physical health, wisdom, and discernment. This is a story in Daniel, the 1st chapter. And then in Proverbs 23, verse 20, it shows us that it's not good to be among gluttonous eaters of meat. For more than 125 years, Seventh-day Adventists have practiced the vegetarian dietary lifestyle because of their belief in the holistic nature of man. So whatever is done in eating or drinking, it's believed to honor and glorify God. The use of any food substance which has been demonstrated as harmful is a dishonor to God. It shows lack of respect for the body and is a disservice to mankind. So today I would like to demonstrate a kind of vegetarian dish that comes the closest to resembling meat than any other. So for those of you who crave that texture and taste of meat, this product we call gluten is a good substitute. If beans and tofu just don't do it for you, you might want to try cutlets or steaklets made out of gluten. So what is gluten? Gluten is the protein of wheat. And here we have wheat. Wheat comes from the field, just like we see it here. And when it's harvested, it comes right out of the hull, and here we have wheat. There are different kinds of wheat, but this one here is dark brown and red. This is the kind that we need to make gluten, and this is the bread-making wheat also. And you can make wheat and gluten out of wheat in several different ways. And so you may want to get a pad of paper and some pencils, maybe jot down a few things. You might want to watch the end of the show for the information about where you could order the Cooking by the Book cookbook if you would like all of the details about the recipes that we're showing here. But it's sort of like a 3-step process to make gluten. I sometimes wonder who ever discovered this way long time ago. But as we said earlier, my mother and her mother made gluten, and it's an interesting thing that if you take a kernel of wheat and you chew it in your mouth, you can make the gluten right in your mouth. So what we'll do is just grind some of this wheat into flour, and then we'll make it into a dough, and then we'll just go through a process of separating out just the protein part of the wheat. Let's just pull up this chart here and remind us about wheat. Here we have a kernel of wheat. And so that you know where the gluten is coming from out of the wheat, this is three parts to the kernel. We have the outer coverings, which is the bran. Then the germ of the wheat is the life-giving part. That's the part from which white flour is, this is the part where the vitamin E and the minerals and vitamins and the sprouting come right out of the wheat. And then right in the heart of the kernel is the endosperm. That's the starch and the protein. And that is the part from which the gluten is made. And so we need to go through a little washing process where we remove this outer covering and we just end up with this protein. It creates sort of a substance that kind of has the texture of meat when you get all finished with it. And you can actually get cookbooks that tell about making gluten. I have 3 cookbooks here. And I've just collected some of these over time. How to make all the meat you eat out of wheat, an entire cookbook that tells you how to season it like beef and like chicken and turkey and hot dogs and sausage and everything else. So we'll demonstrate a little bit of that to you today. Here's another gluten cookbook, Meatless Protein at 1/10 of the cost. Here's a different book. So if you want to find a cookbook on gluten, just go browse some bookstores and you may just find one. It's not a difficult process. It just takes several different steps. So let's do that. And I have Pat here today. Would you come and join me, Pat? Now we're going to see if we can make some gluten here. Now you can make gluten out of whole wheat flour. You can make gluten out of white flour. And you can make gluten out of gluten flour. Gluten flour is just flour that's made, here's what it looks like, after you take the starch out and have only the protein left from the endosperm or from white flour. If you took white flour and took the starch away and you'd have just the protein, this is available as gluten flour at some health food stores and you may find it in your area. And if you had this is just an instant way to just mix this with water and you will have gluten immediately. But what I do most of the time, because it's cheaper, is to start with whole wheat flour, which we have here in the bag. And I would just like to show you how I do this at home. I buy wheat in the 50-pound bags. This is the flour mill here. And I'm going to just put a little wheat through. This will become whole wheat flour, and that's what I'll use to make the gluten. It's the most economical way to do it. So we'll just turn this on. And we just magic, we have the flour right here. And this is the bread flour right here. And this is what we'll use to make the gluten. But we have some already ground ahead. And we'll just start our recipe right now. So making homemade gluten, which is a meat-like plant source of protein. The recipe is in our Cooking by the Book cookbook on page 148. And it's so easy, you just write down 8 cups of flour. It can be the whole wheat or the white, it can be half and half. And then we just put 3 to 4 cups of water with that. So you make a dough just like you were making bread. We happen to have a kitchen machine that has the dough hook here. We're putting it into position. And we'll just put this 8 cups of flour right into the machine. And this dough just needs to knead for about 10 minutes. And if you don't have an electric machine, just get a big bowl out and mix this dough by hand. So we have 8 cups of flour here in the bowl, and we're just going to add 4 cups of water to this. And get the water here. Three to 4 cups. I like to make it just a little heavier if it needs it. Okay. And this just needs to knead now for about 10 minutes. And we'll turn it on here, give it the lid here so it won't spill out. This is just on low speed for 10 minutes. That develops the gluten, the elastic. Wheat has a certain kind of protein that is not found anywhere else, and that is called gluten. And it's the only kind of protein that can become elastic as you stretch it and knead it. See that going around. Have a dough here. And after that's become elastic, then that's the excellent thing to use to make bread. So it's very important to have the hard wheat. That's especially for making bread because it has this gluten protein in it. So Pat, we're just going to have another little magic here and bring up the next gluten. We have a batch of gluten here that's gone for the 10 minutes, and we'll go right on with the next process of the recipe here. The next step after you make the dough then is to separate it. What we have here is the starch of the flour, we have the protein, we have the whole thing. So what we want to do is wash it. Now this sounds like kind of a strange process, but it works, and it takes a few minutes. We'll just show you how to do that. And this dough here has been stretchy. You see, you can see the strands of gluten have become elastic, and you can separate that out. So what you do is go over to your sink with a kind of a colander strainer here, and you just pull off kind of a chunk of this dough, and you start washing it under the water. And this is kind of fun, actually. You can just kind of squeeze around on it with a slow stream of water. And you can also put a pan underneath there. When I'm at home in my bigger sink, where my bigger sink is, I'll just put a big kind of a dish pan under this, and you can actually save the bran and make it in recipes. But what we're doing now is to just wash this and separate it out so that we'll just get the protein part off by itself. And one of the ways you know when it's getting close to being ready is that you think it's falling apart and you think you're doing everything wrong, and then all of a sudden it firms up in your hands and you actually have a piece of almost like pure protein. That's just the protein from wheat. Now the protein from wheat is what we would call an incomplete protein, but by the time you put this with your dinner meal and you eat other things at the meal, then, of course, you have the other proteins that come from the other foods, and it's really quite nice. And you can make this into all kinds of meat dishes, and we're going to show you some delicious-looking steaks and scallops here, and you can grind it into veggie burger, and it's fun to create all kinds of dishes. So you can see that this is firming back up here. We're just about finished. I leave a little bit of the bran in it because it's more tender. If you like your steaks tender, then you can do that. So that's the next step. Now at this point, this is plain raw flour and water dough that's just been washed, and it actually doesn't have much flavor. And so the next step of the recipe here then is to make it have some flavor. So we'll call this done here. And what you would do at home is you would just set this one aside, and you would take another hunk of this. You would just keep washing it until you got all of this dough here washed. And you're going to end up with a smaller amount of this gluten because you are just wanting this rubbery kind of spongy part, which is the gluten. Now, of course, if you make this from white flour, it's going to be a whiter meat, and that's how you get the meat that looks more like fish, the lighter meat or the chicken. And if you want it to be totally instant process where you don't have to do this washing step, then you buy this gluten flour, because all you do is mix water with that one, and boom, you've got this gluten immediately. However, this gluten flour could cost you about $1.95 a pound, or somewhere like that, where this wheat here costs you maybe 35 to 45 cents a pound. So it really is an economical way to get some vegetarian meat. Okay, so now what we have here on the tray is the flavorings that we want to put into the meat today. And in the cookbook here on page 149, we have samples of 2 kinds of broth that you can make to drop the meat into to get the flavor. And we have on the stove here our water. For the savory broth, I'm going to make a dark broth, sort of like for beef-looking meat. And this is savory broth number 1. And it calls for 8 cups of water. And we're going to turn this heat up on high. And it's nice to have that water boiling and everything in there boiling when you drop the pieces of gluten into that. And it doesn't stick back together that way. The next thing is a half a cup of soy sauce. You make this broth so strong that you say to yourself, wow, this is going to be way over seasoned. But it isn't. Just trust me, it will turn out right, and you'll have the broth left afterwards. But you drop the gluten into the broth, and you just let that sort of simmer for about 45 minutes. And at that point, you can use it. You can brown it in a skillet. You can chop it up. You can make veggie burger out of it. Okay, we have a cup of tomato juice here. Again, you could create your own broth recipe. You could just suit yourself. Sometimes I like to use V8 juice because it even has a little more flavor. 1 tablespoon Nutritional food yeast flakes. This is not the yeast for baking. This is a flavoring yeast called Nutritional food yeast flakes. Something like brewer's yeast. It gives a nice meaty flavor. You'll find in vegetarian dishes, at least in my cookbook, we use this Nutritional food yeast flakes many times to give kind of a meaty, cheesy flavor. 2 tablespoons onion powder. Or you can put 2 fresh onions in here. You can chop up your vegetables to make your broth if you'd like to have everything fresh. That's nice to do that also. Onions, you can save your celery leaves and put them in your broth. And you don't waste anything that way. Now, another kind of a meaty flavoring that you can get is from kind of a heavy brewer's yeast paste, Nutritional food yeast paste. My mother used this kind of paste when I was still young at home. It comes under several different names. This is called Marmite, and this is available. I buy this in the Safeway store at home. It's very strong smelling stuff. It's 100% vegetarian. It's high in the B vitamins, and it's actually just made from Nutritional food yeast. And we're going to put a little of this into the broth. This is another one called Vegex. And if you don't have this, then you can just add more bouillon cubes, because there's all different kinds of bouillon cubes that you can get. And the recipe actually calls for about 2 tablespoons of some kind of heavy gravy-based paste, such as Marmite or Vegex, and also 4 to 6 bouillon cubes. So we have what we call double-sized bouillon cubes here. These are vegetable bouillon cubes. We got these at the natural food store. They're actually a product from Switzerland, but there are lots of different kinds of bouillon cubes. We're going to drop some of these in to give seasoning for the broth. And you may have heard of Kitchen Bouquet, which is kind of a liquid that you can buy, a seasoning, or Magi seasoning. These are things that I know you can get in the supermarket. And they too could be used to give sort of a heavy, kind of a beef-like flavor to things. So let me just try to guess here, which is about 2 tablespoons here. Put a little bit more. We had some company visiting us from Australia. Some students were on a music tour, and we had some of them sleeping at our house. And I said, well, what do you miss the most since you've been away from Australia? And they said that it was this Marmite product. They don't call it Marmite. They call it something else over there. But I happened to have this Vegex and Marmite, and I said, here, would you like to try this? And they just spread it right on bread and eat it like peanut butter. And they just thought that was so wonderful because they'd been out of their country for so long without having that wonderful, strong stuff. I don't think I could enjoy it that way, but it really gives a nice flavoring to our broth. Now, we just really want this to boil, but we're not going to wait. Let's just pretend that that's boiling. What you do now is you can take a cutting board here and you can lay out, you'll have more gluten in this, and you can pat it out into whatever shape you want. You can cut it with a knife, you can pinch it with your hands, and it will take on whatever kind of shape you want. It fluffs up a little when you put it in the broth, but once it's simmered in the broth for 45 minutes, then it's going to be fluffy and it's going to be set. Then it won't wobble around, and it will just take the shape. I hope this isn't going to confuse you, but one other thing that you can do, and it explains it in some of these cookbooks too, is that if you wanted this to take a certain shape, let's say you wanted every one of these to be exactly round, you can take a can, like a vegetable can, and you can grease it, and you can put a chunk of this dough right down in the can and just bake it for about a half an hour at 350. And then when you take it out, it'll hold that shape, and you can slice it, and then you can drop that right into the broth here, and they'll just be perfectly round, just like you want them. And that's it. We've made gluten. It's in the broth there. And we would like to show you some finished product here so that you can kind of see what it looks like. Here we have a scallops and tartar sauce. This is a recipe in the cookbook on page 153. Tartar sauce made out of tofu, and it's kind of a light meat look. And the second one here is tasty steaks. This is kind of a darker meat like we're putting in the broth here right now. And we have this one seasoned with red bell peppers and onions, and this is on page 150 in the book. And if you take your grinder, your meat and food grinder, you can grind this gluten once you pull it out of the broth and make burgers out of it. This is a veggie burger, and we have it shown here to put in our patty with all the trimmings to make your veggie burger patty, or you can use it for the tacos. We have some commercially prepared products that you can find in stores in the markets that you can do this quicker if you don't want to take the time to make it at home. However, it is not as economical. Well, we just hope you enjoyed our show today, and we just thank you for tuning in. And by the way, we just like to remind you that this program is sponsored by the Three Angels Broadcasting Network. Your prayers and financial support are greatly appreciated.
If you've enjoyed the recipes and cooking tips in this program, you'll want to order our Food for Thought resource sheet. We'll tell you how you can order the cookbooks you've seen used on this program, along with other information that will help you cook healthful, attractive vegetarian meals. For your free copy of our Food for Thought resource sheet, please write to us at Food for Thought, P.O. Box 220, West Frankfort, Illinois 62896, or call 618-627-4651.